The morning was heavy with fog as Lieutenant Commander Kara Dwyer crouched behind a rock, her heart pounding as she assessed the chaos surrounding her. The team was gone, ambushed in an instant by a well-orchestrated attack. She could still hear the crack of gunfire echoing in her mind, the screams of her men lost in the air. But now it was just her, bleeding, wounded, and completely alone. The taste of iron filled her mouth as she assessed her position, adrenaline making every breath feel like fire. She had no backup, no air support. And yet, in that moment, something inside her hardened. She wasn't running, she wasn't hiding. She was going to make them regret ever hunting her. For a few moments she stayed still, the sounds of the world around her muffled by the blood pounding in her ears. A sharp crack to her right made her instinctively grip her rifle, the barrel steady and unyielding in her hands. They were closing in. They thought they were tracking her, but she wasn't running. Not yet. She was setting the stage, drawing them in. Her father had taught her that. The best defense isn't always running. It's making them think you're running while you set the perfect trap. With slow, measured steps, she began to move, her body protesting with every agonizing movement, but she couldn't afford to show weakness. Not now. Her focus narrowed to the task at hand. They wouldn't find her the way they thought they would. The wounded animal they believed they were hunting was about to become the predator, and they would never see it coming. The first part of the plan was simple. Stay alive. Leave a trail. Make them follow. She pulled herself through the narrow ravine, every breath an effort, every step measured. They were coming, but they hadn't figured it out yet. She could hear them, calling out commands, moving with the efficiency of a trained team. It was time to let them think they were close. They weren't, not yet. And when the time came, when they were in range, she would turn the tables. The hunt would begin. But first, she had to survive. She couldn't afford to die here. Not yet. Not when everything depended on the next move. The terrain was unforgiving, but Kara had learned to read it like the back of her hand. Every rock, every tree, every bend in the earth told her a story. She crawled through the mud, her body on fire with pain, but her mind sharp as ever. The blood from her leg wound was still leaking, and she could feel the sticky warmth against her skin. Every movement was a conscious effort, each one slower than the last, but she couldn't stop. Not yet. She wasn't sure how much longer she could last, but she would be damned before she let them take her alive. Kara paused, listening. The voices behind her were closer now. They were tracking her blood trail, convinced that she was still fleeing. But they were wrong. She wasn't running. She was setting them up. She had learned how to hide in plain sight, how to leave just enough of a trace to make them think they were getting closer. A blood smear on a tree trunk here, a boot print there. Nothing too obvious, but just enough to keep them on her tail. The more they followed, the closer they got to the trap. It was the perfect kind of psychological warfare. They believed they were chasing a wounded animal. But Kara wasn't the prey. She was the hunter. Her fingers tightened around her weapon as she listened to the distant sounds of her pursuers. They were becoming more confident, their movements more methodical. Their leader, Viper, had no idea what he was up against. He was thinking with his gut, not with his head. That was his first mistake. She had prepared for this moment. For every movement they made, she had already calculated her response. Every step they took, every sound they made, would lead them closer to their doom. Kara had one advantage they didn't: time. And now it was starting to run out for them. She could hear the voices getting louder. They were closing in, unaware that every inch they gained was a step closer to their end. Kara's breath came in ragged gasps, her pulse quickening. It was time. She made her move. Crawling through the broken landscape, she angled herself into a narrow defile that led upward. The next part of the plan was simple: get them where she wanted them. And when they were in the kill zone, she would make them pay for underestimating her. The wind howled through the ravine as Kara moved with the utmost care, each step calculated to avoid detection. The mountains around her seemed to close in, offering only limited cover as she ascended the narrow path. She had to keep moving, keep them following. The first rule of survival: stay one step ahead. The second rule: never let them see you sweat. Kara's leg felt like it was on fire with every movement, the jagged edge of the wound cutting deeper with each agonizing step. But she couldn't afford to stop, not when everything depended on her. The voices behind her were louder now. She could hear them discussing their plans, their confidence growing with every passing minute. The trap was set. All she had to do was wait. Kara ducked behind a rocky outcrop, her rifle steady in her hands. The kill zone was in sight, the narrow ledge ahead offering perfect sight lines. She wasn't running anymore. She was waiting. The next few minutes would determine everything. Her heart pounded in her chest as she scanned the path below. Then she saw it. The first figure appeared, his silhouette cutting through the mist. He moved with precision, a soldier accustomed to combat. He wasn't alone. Two more men followed, moving in formation, their eyes scanning the terrain with the practiced discipline of professionals. But they were moving too quickly, too confidently. Kara's plan was working. They were walking into her trap. The lead man, carrying the tablet, didn't even know he was about to become the first casualty of the hunt. As the trio advanced, Kara's finger tightened on the trigger. Her shot rang out, a single precise crack that shattered the silence. The rear guard dropped without a sound, his body crumpling into the dirt. The second man spun, his weapon coming up, but it was too late. Kara was already moving, slipping through the shadows like a ghost, positioning herself for the next shot. The lead man was next. He dove for cover behind a rock, shouting into his radio. But Kara was already on the move, calculating his next move. One shot, then another, and he was down. The tablet fell to the ground with a dull thud, still in his hand. She had it. The next phase of the plan was in motion, but there was no time to savor the victory. More men were coming. The hunt was far from over. Kara's chest heaved with exhaustion, but she was driven by something deeper than pain. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was fighting for her team, for their honor, and for revenge. The fire in her veins burned hotter with each passing second. She had taken the first step. Now she had to finish what she started. The forest was quiet for a moment, but only for a moment. Kara crouched low, the tablet clutched in her hands as she surveyed the scene. The men who had followed her, who thought they were hunting a wounded operator, had no idea what had just happened. They were down, but she wasn't done yet. Her body ached, each breath a battle, but the adrenaline was a sharp, burning force that kept her moving. She checked her surroundings. The terrain was perfect for what she had in mind. Dense woods, narrow defiles, and steep inclines that would funnel her pursuers right into her line of sight. She wasn't just going to survive. She was going to make them pay for everything they'd done. Slowly, carefully, she moved toward a high point on the ridge. The path ahead was treacherous, the rocks slippery from the early morning dew. Her vision blurred from blood loss, but she kept her focus. She had the advantage. They were still searching for her, thinking she was fleeing, but all she had to do was wait for them to come closer. The trap had already been set. Kara's mind raced, calculating their every move. She had been tracking them for hours, listening to their transmissions, mapping out their positions. But she wasn't relying on technology alone. Her father had taught her how to think like her prey, how to predict on every movement, how to control the narrative of the hunt. And now she was in control. The next wave of enemies was closing in. She could hear their boots crunching over the rocks, the quiet murmur of their voices drifting on the wind. They were moving in formation, but they were too confident, too sure of themselves. They didn't know the real threat was already in front of them. Kara was ready. She slid into position, taking cover behind a large boulder, her rifle trained on the path below. Her hands were steady, despite the pain. This was it. They thought they had her cornered, but she was going to make them regret that. The first man appeared, a shadow moving through the trees. He didn't see her. He never would. The shot rang out, the quiet of the forest shattered by the crack of the rifle. The man fell without a sound. Another followed, more cautious this time, but Kara was already repositioning. She took him out, one shot, no hesitation. There was no time to waste. She was moving too fast for them to keep up. The next man, the one carrying the radio, had no idea what was coming. Kara watched him for a moment, analyzing his movements. He was a professional, but so was she. This time, she didn't wait for him to reach the kill zone. She moved, fast and silent, and when he turned to face her, it was already too late. One shot, then another. He crumpled to the ground. The radio slipped from his hand, landing with a dull thud in the dirt. It was hers now. She had the intelligence she needed. But still, there was more to do. The sound of helicopters filled the air in the distance. Extraction was coming. But it wasn't here yet. Kara had no plans of waiting around. She was going to finish this. The hunt wasn't over. Not yet. The forest around her seemed to close in, the thick pines blocking out most of the light as Kara made her way deeper into the woods. Every step was measured, calculated, despite the sharp pain that lanced through her leg with every movement. She couldn't afford to stop now, not when she was so close to finishing what she had started. The radio in her hand crackled with static, and Kara listened intently as the voices of her pursuers filled the airwaves. They were panicking now. 4 men down. They were coming for her, but they weren't as confident as before. She could hear the change in their tone, the tension creeping into their voices. The psychological game she had been playing was working. They didn't know where she was anymore. They didn't know how many were left. And that uncertainty, that fear, was all she needed to keep moving. Her mind worked quickly, formulating the next step. They were still out there, tracking her, believing that they were in control. But Kara had learned long ago that control was a fragile thing. The moment they lost it, everything would change. She had to make them lose it completely. She made her way to a high point, the jagged rocks underfoot offering a clear view of the terrain below. The helicopters in the distance had grown louder, but they weren't near enough to offer her any comfort. She had to rely on herself. She glanced at the tablet, the one she had taken from the man she'd killed earlier. It was still intact. The data on it was crucial. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about exposing the corruption, the operation that had led to her team's deaths. She wasn't going to let that go. As she scanned the landscape, she could see the faint figures of the remaining men moving through the trees below. They were split up now, working in smaller teams. It was a good tactic, but it was also a mistake. They had underestimated her, and that was the biggest mistake they could have made. Kara settled into position, adjusting her rifle with the precision of someone who had spent years honing this craft. She was in control now. No more running, no more hiding. She was the predator, and they were her prey. She took a deep breath, steadying her aim. One by one, the men below began to appear, unaware of the trap that was closing in around them. Kara waited. The first one was easy. She took him out with a clean shot, the sound of the rifle echoing in the stillness. The second man was more cautious, but it didn't matter. Kara had already anticipated his movement. A quick shift in position, and he was gone. The third man appeared, moving through the trees with a sense of urgency. He wasn't paying attention. That was his last mistake. One shot, center mass. He fell without a sound. Kara adjusted her position again, scanning the area for any more threats. But the remaining men were careful now. They had learned from their mistakes. Still, it didn't matter. Kara was always one step ahead. She would finish this. The hunt was almost over. Kara's heart raced as she watched the remaining men move cautiously through the dense trees, the hunt shifting into a final phase she had carefully orchestrated. The mountain air was thick with tension, every breeze carrying the faintest whisper of danger. She was alone, surrounded by an invisible battlefield, and yet she was calm. She had been preparing for this moment her entire life. The first 3 men were down, but there were still more. There was always more. She had to move quickly now, while they were still reeling from the losses. She adjusted the scope on her rifle, watching the figures below like a hawk eyeing its prey. Her wounds screamed for attention, but she ignored them. The pain was just a reminder of what she had to do. Every shot, every move, every breath was a step toward victory. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. The remaining men were beginning to regroup, more cautious now, each man aware of the trap that was slowly closing in. They weren't running, they weren't panicking. They were professionals, experienced operators who had no idea what they were truly facing. Kara had the upper hand, but it wouldn't be enough to sit back and wait. She had to keep them on the move. She had to keep them off balance. She repositioned herself, climbing higher into the rocks, her movements deliberate. It wasn't the quickest path, but it was the safest. She wasn't just trying to survive anymore. She was playing them, manipulating every step they took. The sound of boots crunching on gravel reached her ears, and she paused, waiting. One man came into view, moving slowly but deliberately. He was checking the ground for signs of her, unaware that he was walking right into her line of sight. He was too confident, too comfortable. Kara smiled grimly. He was the next piece in her game. She aimed, breath steady, and fired. The shot rang out, the sound of it almost deafening in the still air. The man dropped like a rag doll, his body crumpling to the ground before he even realized what hit him. But she couldn't pause. There were still others out there. She moved quickly, positioning herself higher, closer to the edge of the ridge. She had to control this ground. She had to force them into a corner. The second man appeared just as she had anticipated. He moved quickly, scanning the area with a practiced eye. He wasn't easy prey, but Kara had already mapped out his route. She waited until he was in the perfect spot. One shot. One kill. He fell with a soft grunt, his body collapsing into the underbrush below. Kara's breath caught for a moment as she heard the faint crackle of radio chatter in the distance. Viper was speaking now, his voice tinged with frustration. He was ordering his men to regroup, to tighten the search. But he didn't know what she knew. He didn't know she was hunting them. They weren't hunting her anymore. The remaining men were beginning to move more carefully now, spread out, trying to maintain a semblance of control. But that was their second mistake. They were playing right into her hands. Kara checked her ammunition, steadying herself. She had enough for this, for what came next. The final confrontation. She was ready. The faint sound of footsteps reached Kara's ears. She didn't have to look to know that the remaining men were closing in. They were no longer moving in the same tight formations. They were spread out, more cautious, trying to anticipate her next move. They knew they were being hunted, but they didn't know where the threat was coming from. It was the perfect position for her. Kara crouched lower, her body trembling from exhaustion and pain, but she forced herself to focus. She could hear the distant hum of helicopters in the air, but they were too far away to offer any immediate help. She had to finish this on her own. The men below her were moving in search patterns, staying low, checking every corner of the dense forest. They were professionals, no doubt, but they didn't have the terrain on their side. Kara had the upper hand. The next part of the plan was crucial. She needed to draw them into the kill zone. It wouldn't take much. A few well-placed distractions. A trail. Bloodstains. It was all part of the game she had been playing. She adjusted her position, slipping behind a cluster of boulders, listening intently. Her breath was ragged, her body screaming for rest. But she couldn't stop. Not yet. she had a final move to make. The wind shifted, and with it came the sound of footsteps, slow and methodical. Two men appeared, moving through the trees, their eyes scanning the landscape. They were getting closer to her position, closer to the trap. She held her breath, waiting for the right moment. The first man passed within arm's reach, but he didn't see her. She could have taken him out right then, but she needed them both. Kara was patient. She waited. As the second man moved into view, she raised her rifle, slowly, deliberately, and fired. The shot rang out, hitting the second man square in the chest. He dropped instantly, but the first man reacted in a split second. He spun, raising his weapon, but it was too late. Kara had already shifted position, and before he could aim, she fired again. The second shot hit him in the throat, and he crumpled to the ground without a sound. Two more down. She had made her move, and it had paid off. But there was no time to celebrate. The other men were closing in, their voices growing louder, their movements more frantic. Kara knew they wouldn't give up easily, but they had underestimated her. They had made the mistake of thinking they were the hunters, and now they were the prey. She moved quickly, making her way to a new position, knowing that the final confrontation was drawing near. Her extraction was still hours away, but she didn't care. She had a job to finish, and she was going to finish it her way. The tension in the air was thick now. Kara could feel it in her bones, the way the men were moving, the slight shift in the atmosphere that told her the hunt was nearing its end. She was wounded, exhausted, but every fiber of her being was focused on one thing: survival. They thought they were in control. They were wrong. The remaining operatives were converging on her position. She could hear their radios crackling with urgent orders. They were getting desperate, each movement more frantic than the last. They still had no idea where she was, but they were closing in. Kara watched them from her vantage point, high up on the ridge. They were moving in pairs now, scanning the ground, looking for any trace of her. She smiled grimly. They didn't realize they were already standing in the middle of her trap. The rocks below her formed a natural funnel, a perfect place for the next phase of her plan. She had spent hours setting the stage for this moment. Now it was time to execute it. She checked her weapon, the rifle steady in her hands, and took a deep breath. Time seemed to slow as she watched the men approach, completely unaware of the imminent danger. They were so close now. One more move, and she'd have them. She shifted slightly, moving behind a large boulder to get a better angle. Her heart thudded in her chest as she settled into position. The first man came into view, moving cautiously through the trees, his weapon at the ready. But Kara had already planned her shot. She fired, the sound of the shot echoing through the forest. The man crumpled to the ground, his body falling silently, just another casualty in the long list of mistakes they had made. The second man, now fully aware that something was wrong, rushed forward, but he too fell victim to Kara's precision. Another shot, another life taken without hesitation. Her heart was steady now, her breathing controlled. There was no fear left in her, just a cold determination. She was in control. The final pieces were falling into place. Kara moved quickly, slipping through the trees to find a new position. She had to be quick. There were still more to come. As she repositioned, the sound of their footsteps reached her ears again, but this time they were more cautious. They had learned from their mistakes. They were starting to realize that this wasn't a simple manhunt. This was a battle. And they were losing. Kara adjusted her rifle once more, her eyes scanning the area ahead. The sun was beginning to rise, the first light casting long shadows across the mountainside. She had been out here for hours, but the end was in sight. She was going to make sure that the men who had come to kill her would never see another sunrise. She was going to finish this. And when it was over, the people behind this would know that they had made a deadly mistake by underestimating her. She wasn't just a wounded operator. She was a force to be reckoned with. Kara's breath was steady, her focus razor-sharp as she moved from one position to the next, always a step ahead of the men tracking her. The forest seemed to close in around her, the dense pines offering little cover but plenty of opportunities to strike. The first light of dawn filtered through the canopy, casting a dim glow across the forest floor. It was a quiet kind of chaos. The remaining men were on edge, their voices tense over the radio as they coordinated their next moves. But Kara was no longer the hunted. She was the predator, and the endgame was near. She checked her ammunition, mentally calculating the number of shots she had left. The plan had worked so far, taking them out one by one, using the terrain, making them underestimate her every move. But there was still Viper to deal with. He was the one calling the shots, the one who had orchestrated her team's slaughter. He was the one she was hunting now. She'd killed 5 of his men, but he wouldn't come in until he was certain she was dead. She needed to make him feel the pressure. She needed him to think she was cornered, and that's exactly what she did. She left another trail, carefully placing bloodstains, leaving footprints that led straight toward a narrow ravine. It was a perfect spot, a place she knew would funnel them right into her waiting line of fire. She moved swiftly, taking cover in a small alcove just off the path. The men were coming. She could hear them, the crunch of gravel under their boots, the low murmur of their voices. They were on high alert now, each one scanning the trees, aware that the next step could be their last. But they weren't prepared for what Kara had set in motion. As the first man passed within range, she squeezed the trigger. The shot was clean, swift, and silent. He dropped, his body crumpling in an instant. The others froze, the realization dawning too late. They began to scramble, moving in different directions, but it was all part of Kara's plan. She repositioned, slipping into the shadows like a ghost, and took out another. One by one, they fell until only Viper remained. His men were dead, and now it was his turn. Kara's pulse quickened as she moved, careful not to give away her position. Viper was good, but so was she. He was about to learn that the game he'd started was about to end on her terms. She reached for the radio, her fingers moving deftly over the controls. She didn't need to speak. She just needed him to hear her. The crackle of static filled the air, followed by the sound of Viper's voice, calm, authoritative. "I know you're out there. I've been tracking you. But you're not going to win this. I will find you." Kara's lips curled into a grim smile. She wasn't running anymore. The game was over, and Viper had walked straight into her trap. The final confrontation was at hand. Kara crouched low behind a large boulder, the sound of Viper's voice still fresh in her ears. His words were confident, almost mocking, as if he truly believed that he was in control. But Kara knew better. She had made sure he would come. She had baited him with every move, each step a calculated decision, leading him straight into the heart of her trap. The forest was eerily silent now, save for the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. It was just her and Viper now. The endgame had arrived. Kara moved slowly, carefully, her rifle at the ready. She knew Viper would be cautious, but she also knew he had a certain arrogance, a belief that he was untouchable. That was his mistake. She had already anticipated his movements, had already mapped out every route he could take. Her position gave her the advantage. The boulder she was hiding behind provided perfect cover, and the narrow ravine below would force him into a single-file approach. It was the perfect kill zone. Kara's eyes never left the path below. Her breath was steady, her focus unshakable. She had taken out all of his men. Now it was his turn. She could hear the faint crunch of boots on gravel, the steady rhythm of someone moving with purpose. She knew he was close. Kara adjusted her grip on the rifle, her fingers resting lightly on the trigger. She had done this countless times before, but this time there was something different. This time, it wasn't just a mission. This time, it was personal. The first flash of movement caught her eye. Viper appeared, moving cautiously but with confidence, scanning the surroundings. He wasn't making any rookie mistakes. He was aware of the danger, but he couldn't know exactly where it was coming from. Kara waited, holding her breath, the rifle steady against her shoulder. He was getting closer. Another step, and then another. She squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, but Viper was faster. He ducked just in time, the bullet missing him by inches. Kara's heart raced, but she didn't hesitate. She quickly shifted her position, moving to the side, using the terrain to her advantage. Viper's response was immediate. He fired back, his shot ringing out through the trees, but it was a blind shot, desperate. Kara had already anticipated his move. She fired again. This time the shot found its mark. Viper staggered back, his body jerking as the bullet hit him square in the chest. He fell to his knees, but he wasn't dead yet. His eyes locked with hers, filled with a mix of disbelief and rage. But Kara didn't give him the chance to speak. She fired once more, the shot putting an end to his life. Silence filled the air, broken only by the sound of her heavy breathing. It was over. The last of the men who had killed her team was gone. Kara stood there for a moment, her rifle still aimed at his lifeless body. Her pulse was slowing, the adrenaline finally wearing off, leaving her with a deep sense of exhaustion. She had done it. She had avenged her team. But the victory felt hollow. The forest around her seemed to blur as her mind drifted to the faces of the men she had lost. They wouldn't see another sunrise. And now, neither would Viper. Kara checked her watch. The extraction team would be here soon. But for now, she was alone, alone with the weight of what had happened, alone with the knowledge that this was just the beginning. There would be no peace, not for her, not for any of them. As the first light of dawn crept over the mountains, Kara stood silently over the body of Viper. The forest was still, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The sounds of the birds, the rustling of the leaves, all felt distant and muffled. It was hard to shake the feeling that the world had changed in those final moments, when the last of the enemy forces had been extinguished and she had claimed her vengeance. Yet, in the quiet aftermath, a heavy emptiness lingered. She wasn't sure how long she stood there, staring down at Viper's body, her rifle still clutched tightly in her hands. She could feel the blood from her wounds trickling down her leg, soaking her clothes, the warmth of it strangely grounding her in the harsh reality of the moment. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something deeper, something more personal. Her team, her brothers and sisters in arms, were gone. There was no bringing them back. This victory, however hard-earned, wouldn't erase that fact. A flicker of motion in the distance caught her eye. The helicopters were finally approaching. Extraction was on its way. But Kara wasn't sure she was ready to leave yet. Not just yet. She took one last look at the body of Viper, her face a mask of cold determination. He had been a cog in the machine, a part of something far bigger, something that had claimed the lives of her team and many others. But now, he was nothing. Just another dead man in a war that would never end. She moved away from his body, her steps slow and deliberate, the weight of each one sinking into the earth beneath her. Her body screamed for rest, for relief from the pain, but there was no time for that. There were still questions to answer. There were still secrets to uncover. She reached into her pack and pulled out the tablet, the one she had taken from Viper's men earlier. She powered it up, scanning through the data that was now in her hands. It wasn't just about the Sievo operation anymore. This was bigger, much bigger. The names, the connections, it all pointed to something far deeper than a simple arms trafficking network. Something connected to the highest levels of power, something she would have to expose. The helicopter blades grew louder, signaling the arrival of her team. But Kara wasn't done. She couldn't be. Not until the full story was revealed, not until the truth came to light. She glanced back at the body of Viper one last time. This wasn't just the end of her fight. This was the beginning of something else. And this time, she wasn't alone. As the helicopter touched down, Kara stepped forward, her eyes focused ahead. The battle was over. But the war was just beginning. The extraction was swift, efficient. The familiar whir of helicopter blades filled the air, and Kara barely had to look up to see the team touching down. But even as the extraction team moved to secure her, she couldn't shake the feeling of the mountain pressing down on her. She was alive, but that was all she was. Alive and full of unspoken questions. The helicopter door slid open, and a team member jumped out, immediately assessing her condition. His eyes lingered on the blood soaking her leg and the bruises marking her skin. But there was no judgment, no time for concern. His focus was on getting her out of there. "Let's move, Commander," he said, his voice crisp with urgency. But Kara hesitated. She couldn't just leave. Not yet. She glanced one last time at the ravine, at the place where everything had changed. The fight was over, but the truth was still buried in the dirt, in the blood, in the shadows of what she had uncovered. There were too many pieces to this puzzle, too many unanswered questions. Her hands clenched around the tablet. They had to know. It wasn't just about her survival anymore. It was about exposing the corruption, the betrayal, that ran deeper than even she had realized. As the extraction team surrounded her, their eyes briefly flickering to the lifeless body of Viper, Kara's mind raced. She could feel the weight of the information in her hands, the names on the tablet, the operations, the connections that led all the way to the heart of the system she had sworn to protect. Her team had died because of this, because of the people who thought they could hide their sins behind closed doors. But Kara wasn't going to let that happen. She couldn't. She had to make sure the truth came out. She looked at the man who had spoken to her. "Get me to Washington," she said, her voice steady but filled with an unspoken promise. The man nodded, seeing the determination in her eyes, and motioned for her to board the helicopter. "We'll get you patched up first, Commander. But the mission isn't over yet." As she climbed into the helicopter, Kara took one last look at the mountain, the place where everything had changed, the place where she had become more than just a soldier, the place where she had become something else. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing. She was going to make them pay, not just for the lives lost, but for the truth that was still hidden beneath the surface. She wasn't done yet. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. The helicopter rose steadily into the air, the mountainous landscape below slowly shrinking away, leaving nothing but the fading image of the terrain where Kara had fought for survival. As the chopper flew toward the horizon, the rush of wind and the dull hum of the rotors became the only sound she could focus on. Her body ached, every movement a reminder of the battle she had just survived. But her mind was elsewhere, focused on what lay ahead, Washington. The people who had orchestrated the events that led to her team's death were still out there, hiding in plain sight. The secrets they buried were still buried, and she had the key to exposing it all. The tablet was still clutched tightly in her hands, its contents now imprinted on her mind. The arms trafficking network, the political connections, the way the lives of her team members had been disposable to people with power. They thought they could get away with it. They thought no one would ever know, but they were wrong. The helicopter's cabin was quiet now, the team members around her talking in low voices, giving her space to process the chaos. She barely noticed them, her thoughts consumed with the mission ahead. The truth was out there, hidden in the shadows of military operations, and it was time for it to come to light. Kara's eyes flickered to the tablet once more, the names and connections now crystal clear. The siege of her team, the betrayal, it was all part of a larger picture, one that involved powerful people, some of whom were sitting behind desks in places like Washington, plotting their next move. They were the ones pulling the strings, and they had no idea that Kara was about to expose them. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. This was about something bigger, something that could change the course of everything. As the helicopter continued its flight, she knew this was just the beginning. She had survived, but she was still at war. The war against corruption, against betrayal, against the lies that had cost so many lives. And she wasn't going to stop until the truth was out there for the world to see. The truth that would make them pay for what they did. Kara's hands tightened around the tablet. She wasn't alone in this fight anymore. The weight of what she had lost and the burden of what she had yet to uncover was now her responsibility. She wasn't just a soldier anymore. She was a messenger, and the truth was going to be heard no matter what it cost. The mission wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The flight to Washington felt endless, yet it was the calm before the storm. Kara sat still, her eyes fixed on the horizon as the helicopter cut through the sky. Her body was drained, bruised and bloodied, but her resolve was stronger than ever. The moment she had survived, the vengeance she had exacted, it wasn't just about her anymore. The faces of her fallen teammates, their memories etched into her mind, kept her moving forward. She had promised them justice. The fight had been won, but the battle for the truth had only just begun. The helicopter descended, and the landscape of Washington became visible below. The city, alive with its own rhythm, seemed so distant from the carnage she had left behind in the mountains. She could almost feel the weight of the world pressing against her chest. As they touched down, Kara's mind was already racing, thinking of the steps that lay ahead. There was no going back. She stepped off the helicopter, her boots landing firmly on the tarmac. A team was waiting for her, officials, agents, and operatives whose loyalty lay with the same system that had failed her and her team. But Kara had something they didn't. She had the truth. The data she carried was explosive, and she knew it. What she didn't know was who could be trusted and who might be part of the very network she was trying to expose. Every step she took on the ground felt like a new battlefield, a game of shadows and lies. As she made her way toward the waiting convoy, her thoughts were interrupted by a voice behind her. "Commander Dwyer," a man said, approaching her with an outstretched hand. He was older, dressed in a suit that screamed authority, but his eyes held a sharpness that didn't sit well with her. "We've been briefed on your operation. We're here to ensure the safety of your intel. We need you to share everything you've uncovered." Kara didn't flinch, but she could feel the weight of his words. She had heard that tone before, one that masked suspicion, perhaps even hostility. She nodded curtly, her eyes narrowing as she sized him up. She had no choice but to trust someone, but the war wasn't over, not by a long shot. She had the information, but it was clear that she wasn't the only one who wanted control of it. "You'll get everything," Kara said, her voice steady. "But don't think for a second this is over. This is just the beginning. There are people out there who killed my team, and I'm not stopping until they pay for it." The man's expression faltered for a moment, but it quickly returned to its professional mask. "Understood," he replied. Kara looked him in the eye, knowing that what came next could change everything. There would be no simple answers. The corruption ran deeper than anyone could imagine, and though she had the power to expose it, it would come at a cost. As the convoy sped toward the secure facility, Kara's mind remained focused on one thing: exposing the truth. The mission had been completed, but the fight was just beginning. She had survived. She had fought back. And now the world was about to know who was really responsible. This story wasn't over, and neither was she. The truth would find its way to the surface, no matter the cost. Jeśli ta historia poruszyła Cię emocjonalnie, zasubskrybuj nasz kanał, podziel się swoją opinią w komentarzach i udostępnij ten film innym.